Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. It is 8 o'clock, but we're going to give folks just another minute or so to hop on, and then we'll go ahead and get started. All right. Well, again, good morning. Thank you for joining us for this early season soybean management webinar. My name is Rachel Van. I'm the NC State Soybean Extension Specialist, and I'm joined this morning by my colleagues, Dr. Wes Everman, Luke Gattiboni, Adrian Gorney, and Dominic Reising, who have expertise in various aspects of soybean management. So we're glad to be here to talk to you about your early season soybean management concerns. There is a wide variety of topics that we could discuss this morning, and there's no way we could present our research and provide our recommendations on this wide range of early season management topics. So for today, for the webinar flow, we are going to provide a very brief presentation on some pertinent updates, and then we are going to pull the audience for areas of interest, and hopefully this is largely going to be a question and answer based webinar based on the topics that y'all want to discuss this morning. But before we get into that aspect of the webinar, we do want to discuss a few things with y'all. First of all, the team of specialists that is on the webinar this morning have been working on preparing to plant for 21 series, so a PFP 21 series, and all of our posts on our various topics are available on the NC State Soybean Extension portal. So we've covered some agronomic topics so far, seed treatment, some cover crop topics, and there's some upcoming fertility and nematode related topics. So we do encourage folks to check out those articles. We post them on the portal. We also send them out through the county extension agents, and take a look at those, and that might generate some questions for the webinar today. So one thing that I wanted to briefly discuss this morning, if you've been at our county extension meetings throughout the winter, you've seen some information on this analysis, but with soybean prices being relatively high right now, we're starting to get a lot of questions about soybean inputs that we may have not gotten over the past few years when prices were a little bit lower. But I wanted to remind folks, this team of folks listed here recently did an analysis on the strongest predictors of yield in the North Carolina soybean yield contest over the past 18 years. So that was 877 entries that came in from across the state of North Carolina. Over a third came out of the Tidewater region, but we still had good representation in the coastal plain and the Piedmont regions. And what we learned in the analysis from the list of production practices that we looked at was that the three strongest predictors of high soybean yield were maturity group, with the use of maturity group 4 or less soybeans providing an advantage over using later maturing varieties. The next largest predictor of soybean yield in these high yield situations was the use of a foliar fungicide. And when you were using an early maturing variety, the third strongest predictor of soybean yield was using earlier planting date. So there were some advantages to planting before mid-May. And as we think about going into the 21 season, two of these three strongest predictors of high soybean yield, maturity group and planting date, can be manipulated without any direct additional economic investment in your soybean. So we just wanted to emphasize that as people are thinking about various inputs and prices going into the season. One thing that's important, and Dominic and I can answer questions about later in this webinar, is that we want to emphasize that shifting to some of these higher yielding management practices, like earlier maturing varieties and earlier planting dates, will likely modify the need for crop protection in your soybean crop, more aggressive management, commitment to season-long scouting. And so we want to emphasize, to really capitalize on some of the benefits from these higher yielding practices, that's going to have to be incorporated into your management regime. So speaking of crop protection, one of the important topics that we wanted to proactively cover today is related to the auxin herbicide situation in soybeans. And Dr. Wes Everman is on, and he will provide a brief update on the auxin herbicide situation.
There we go. I was trying to unmute myself. I apologize. Yeah, so we had a interesting spring, I guess, on the auxins. We had put in last year in anticipation of getting 24C label in the state. Everything we had communicating with EPA had said, we're going to be, really working with each other to try to open up some of the restrictions on a state by state basis. And we put in to try to extend the spray or application date for the dicamba products on soybeans to the end of July. If you see on the screen there, the cutoff dates on the federal label actually were July 30th for cotton and June 30th for soybean. And we didn't feel that really fit us well at all here in North Carolina, especially with our double crop soybean. We built the case in our application that, look, in North Carolina, the Southeast in general, we haven't had the issues that the rest of the country has had as far as off target injury. We've been doing well. Here's all the reasons why we should be, extending the application date to the end of July, just like cotton. They denied that 24C. NCDA, the soybean producers, Farm Bureau, as well as Charlie Cahoon and I, we actually wrote an appeal, sent that back to EPA early March, and said, look, you guys kind of missed this. Here's really the things we need to be looking at. And they came back with an official denial on the 15th and said, no, we are not going to do it a 24C this year. We felt like we provided good data. They said that we didn't provide a good enough case to prove that there would be no injury on off target species or sites at all by expanding that application window to the end of July. So anybody that took the training prior to March 15th, which is all but 2 groups, would have been told in there that July 31st was going to be the cutoff date. It's actually going to be June 30th for our soybeans, July 30th for cotton. Okay. So keep that in mind. It's going to change how we manage our weeds a little bit, right? If you're in an extend flex or extend soybean, or you're in a double crop situation, realize after June 30th, we're not going to be able to apply dicamba. So extend flex, we've got some options with our Liberty link, trait in there. We can use Liberty. If you're just straight extend beans, do realize you're going to have to treat those as Roundup Ready and be prepared to use conventional herbicides. So if you're in a situation where you're going to need that dicamba or Liberty trait after June 30th, make sure you have the right beans. Don't get stuck with straight extend or Roundup Ready to extend beans where you're, limited on options in July. Okay. Now I will let you guys know that Charlie and I are working with the soybean producers as well as NCDA to try to build a better case going forward. We don't think we'll be able to get anything changed this year, but hopefully we'll be able to do something for next year. So that's the 20,000-foot view. If there's any questions about it, I'm happy to answer them.
Thanks for that update, Wes. And I don't think I mentioned this at the beginning of the webinar, but if you have questions, you can utilize the chat function on Zoom, or if you're on a cell, you can press *6 to unmute yourself. So any questions on this topic before we move on? All right. Well, maybe some questions will pop up later for Wes regarding this situation. So, again, we have a team of specialists here to cover a diversity of topics. So, anything listed here are beyond our topics that we're happy to discuss with y'all today. And so, I'm going to stop the presentation and I'm going to put up a polling question for the audience to try to generate some conversation about some of these early season topics. So this is my first time doing polling questions, but hopefully this goes smoothly. So for our growers on the call, our agents working with our growers, who's planning on planting soybeans in April? We have 3 options here. You can just click on these. Yep. Ready to roll as soon as it dries out, hesitant based on previous experience, or no intentions to start planting until May. We'll give people about 30, 40 seconds. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and end the polling now and share the results. And so it looks like, we got 19 growers, 70% of our audience participants that are going to start planting as soon as it dries out here in April. We have a few that are hesitant to start based on previous experience and a few that have no intentions to start planting until May. So for the majority of the folks that responded who are planning to start planting in April, what are some of the early season concerns that you have associated with this early planting system? Please utilize the chat or just unmute to ask your questions. All right, we'll give folks a minute to think about their questions. We actually had some, well, here's one that came up in the chat. We also had some pre-submitted questions as well. So from the chat from Robert, length of time for emergence might be a concern. And that is a good point, Robert. I can talk a little bit from experience. The soybean extension program has been looking at various soybean planting dates over the past few years, and we've had some really early planting situations where we've been planting in mid to late March, and it's taken the soybeans 2 to 3 weeks to emerge. But in those situations, we did have a fungicidal seed treatment on the seed, which we do think is critical to protect the seed during these long emergence periods for early planting. And so even when it took the beans 20 to 25 days to emerge, we still had respectable stands in those situations. I can tell you it doesn't always take a long time for beans to emerge in early planting situations. We started planting research plots last week, and Jalen Waters, the county extension agent in Washington County, reported in yesterday that the beans that we planted last Thursday have already popped out of the ground in Washington County. So, the weather in North Carolina is highly variable. That's going to impact the emergence time. But another concern I'm seeing pop up in the chat here is cold weather impacting early growth and late frost. And we thought this might be an issue that would come up. So I'm going to share my screen. I have a few comments to make about what we can expect from these early season frost issues, particularly if anybody has beans planted right now. I'm not sure anybody, any growers do besides us in our research program. Would love to know, drop it in the chat if you've already planted beans, would love to know. But what temperatures can cause cold injury in soybeans? So we don't have a lot of experience with this in North Carolina. I do see Dr. Dumpy's on the call, who I'm sure in his 45-year career saw some issues with this in North Carolina, if he wants to add anything. But if you look at information that our colleagues provide out of the Midwest, where they're also very interested in early planting and more likely to encounter these frost freeze situations, they typically say that to kill a soybean that's in a young growth stage that's planted early, it would take 28 degrees Fahrenheit or below at the soil surface there for 4 or more hours to actually be lethal and cause a plant death. So a couple things to remember: soil temperatures, particularly when the soils are wet, are typically running higher than air temp. And in that zone where the soybeans emerging, often soil temperature is more closely related to soil temps than air temps. So even if, let's say, we drop below 30 over the next couple nights, it might not mean that, you know, down there in the emergent zone, it's as cold as the air temp. So that's one thing to remember. Soybeans are most susceptible to frost injury in the crook stage, when the hypocotyl is pulling out the cotyledons, or as you can see in this picture, when the cotyledons have unfolded, exposing that new unifoliate tissue or the growing point. The good news for soybeans is even if the growing point is injured by frost or freeze, the soybean plant does have the opportunity to recover with the axillary meristems at the cotyledonary nodes. And when you're planting this early, typically our colleagues in the Midwest have found that the soybeans can recover through that new growth without any impact on yield. So this is a picture of what early season damage can look like out of the University of Wisconsin. I want to just provide some information on things we've seen over the past couple of years. This is an update that we were sent last year from Tim Hambrick, the county agent in the Northwest Piedmont. He sent in some pictures where his growers had planted early and those beans went through several consecutive nights in the 30s without having any injury. And if you do have a frost freeze, let's say you have beans planted now and you are concerned about the next couple nights, it's suggested that you assess this 3 to 5 days after the frost freeze event has occurred before you make decisions about replanting. Look for healthy growing points that are taking off, even if the growing point at the time of the frost freeze event was injured. There, like we already articulated, there's a possibility of new growth coming from those axillary meristems and compensating for some of that early season injury. So that's a few points on that topic, which we thought might be something that came up. So another topic that was requested, I'm going to give this question to Dominic Reising, our entomologist. When folks are thinking about planting this early, Dominic, what types of insects do they need to look out for versus when planting in a full season or double crop situation?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we've done about somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 trials trying to look at early season insects, you know, mostly with seed treatments, but some with foliar sprays. I think the earliest we might have planted would be like April 15th. So I can't say I have experience with beans planted this early, except for I do know that they're going to be susceptible for kudzu bug. And I saw a kudzu bug in my yard last weekend. I saw one the week before. So they're already out with this warm weather. And kudzu bugs love early planted beans. So I know that seedling soybeans are not something that's typically scouted, but kudzu bugs will go to seedling beans, and you should at least walk your field and see if they're there. The numbers you would need to actually stunt the plant, and it does happen, you probably smell them before you got out of the car. Probably most folks are not thinking about kudzu bugs, they're thinking about something like thrips, which can be a real pain in cotton, one of our toughest pests to kill. We have had pretty good thrips numbers in some of those trials I mentioned earlier. We had a trial in Fairfield in Hyde County where we had over 50 thrips per seedling, and those kind of numbers would kill a cotton plant. They stunted the plants, but the plants were able to recover later in the season, and we didn't have any differences in yields at all between our treatments. So I don't really expect any early season insect problems, except for maybe what Rachel mentioned, maybe with the frost. You might see some stunting if you have heavy thrips numbers, but I wouldn't expect it to hamper yield. I would say though, be on the lookout for kudzu bugs if you have beans planted this early.
Thanks for those updates, Dominic. Along those same lines, we'll have a question for Dr. Everman about pre-emergence herbicide concerns, with early planted soybeans. Is there anything we need to look out for with injury issues with some of the conditions we're encountering now?
Yeah, and that's a good question. We often run into injury from our herbicides when it's cool, wet weather, when the soybeans are emerging and in that initial growth phase, right? So if those beans are coming up, the soil's a little bit more wet than what's normal anymore, right? We've just had constant wet weather the last few years, it seems like, in some areas. But we definitely want to be aware that cool weather, wet weather slows down our soybean growth, right? Because they're not growing as actively. You don't have as much metabolism of the herbicide. So it's not being broken down like it should. So you could see symptoms. Typically, this is not going to be a big issue for us as far as just straight herbicide injury goes, as long as the soils dry out a little bit and the weather warms up. Okay, so once we get the favorable growing conditions, those soybeans will start actively growing. They'll start breaking down that herbicide that's in the plant, and they should take off and go. Now, where we run into issues is oftentimes you can compound pests, you could say, or other issues there, right? So because the soybeans are slowed down because weather and they're trying to break down herbicides, they may be more vulnerable to insect pressure or disease pressure. You may see other things go on, and then that's when we get this complex of challenges that are affecting our soybeans that could turn them the other way, and you can watch your soybeans stand decrease. So keep an eye on those, but definitely if it's just a short-term weather spell, we should end up seeing those soybeans turn around.
Thanks, Wes. I see we also had a couple questions for Luke come across in the chat. So Luke, Jonathan asked about AgLogic, which I believe is a fertility related product. And also there's a question for you about any thoughts on additional needs for fertilizing early planted soybeans.
Okay, thank you for the questions. And about the early planting soybeans and the soil fertility, the only thing that I can imagine that could be affected in soil fertility is the phosphorus uptake, because when you have the soil is still cold, we have less release of phosphorus for the plant uptake. However, it's advantageous for corn to put starter phosphorus, but we don't have any result in our state about any advantage of applying starter phosphorus for soybean. And the reason is because the soybean is not as don't need too much phosphorus as corn needs in the beginning of the growing of the plant. And so I don't expect any difference or any special management that we need to have for soil fertility if you are planting early soybean.
Thanks, Luke. And I realize Dominic's keeping me in line that the Ag Logic question should go to Adrian. So, Adrian, I see we got a couple questions in here on nematode damage between early and late planting, and the Ag Logic question, if you could address some of those.
Sure. So I'll start with the early versus late planting for avoiding nematode damage. There has been a little bit of research showing that slightly earlier planted soybeans can avoid some root knot nematode damage, but that's if root knot nematode is the primary concern. The relationship is much less defined for soybean cyst nematode, that it's the earlier versus late planting doesn't seem to do much in terms of soybean cyst. But if root knot is concerned, might avoid a little bit of damage on the earlier side. And then the Ag Logic question, we have seen some decent results with suppressing nematodes with Ag Logic in a variety of crops, not just soybean. Yep.
Great. Well, I see we've got a couple more questions coming in. We'll address one or two of these and then move into another polling question. So Randy Edwards, earlier in the chat, expressed concerns with harvest with tobacco and sweet potatoes going on with some of these earlier maturing varieties. And that's an excellent point that we do need to discuss with our growers in the coastal plain that have some more complex rotation. So I'm going to show a little bit of data from some of our early planting trials, or where we're really looking across a diversity of maturity groups and planting dates. And let's look at what we've seen from a yield perspective and a damage perspective. So over the past couple of years, the soybean extension program has been looking at a wide diversity of planting dates and maturity groups to see what their impact on yield is. So in this graph here, you can see in each of these little boxes, we have different maturity groups. We've looked at two maturity groups 2 through 8 across these different planting dates. On the y-axis, we have yield in bushels per acre. And so at this point in time, we've been able to generate about 8 locations worth of data for this study. We're going to continue doing this work over the next few years. But if we look at our lower yielding environments, which we should really be characterizing as moderate yielding environments, you can actually see the beans in some of those moderate yielding environments have averaged 50 or 60, which is above average for North Carolina. If you look at the planting dates in those moderate yielding environments, we've typically seen the highest yields from late April to mid-May planted beans. There were some yield penalties to really early planting. And I think a large driver of that is that a lot of these moderate yield environments came out of 2019, where we had that pretty hot May. And some of these really early planted beans had already moved into reproductive development under those unfavorable conditions. But if you look at those late April and mid-May planting dates, the maturity group 6 5s and 4s really performed pretty comparably for yield in those early-ish planting situations. And so I think based on this data and what we've seen from a seed quality perspective, which I can show you here in a couple slides. This slide's pretty busy, but planting dates on the x-axis and percent damage is on the y-axis as quantified, how it would be delivered to an elevator. We were trained by the NCDA. You know, we really see with most of our maturity groups, especially our later maturing varieties, even when planted early, that we see pretty low levels of damage compared to some of these earlier maturing varieties planted early. So if you're a sweet potato or a tobacco grower and you're really concerned about your ability to harvest timely to protect seed quality, our data so far indicates that you could plant early, you know, in late April to mid-May to capitalize on some of these yield benefits, but maybe use a maturity group 5 or 6 variety where we're typically seeing less damage to try to gain some of the early planting benefits without running into some of the seed quality issues that you might see with a maturity group 4, for example, where you're more likely to see green stem. You can also see it with an early 5. But that would be one mechanism for a grower with a complex rotation to try to gain some of the early planting benefits, but also try to mitigate some of these seed quality issues. So that's what we've seen from our data on that topic so far. So let's throw in the next polling question. So when we're talking about early season soybean management, we're going to launch a poll and just see what the growers and the agents on this call think is the largest challenge in early season soybean management, and that might drive some subsequent discussion. So we're going to launch this poll and give folks about 40 seconds to complete it. All right, so to share the results, it looks like the majority of folks have identified agronomics as some of the largest challenges. When I listed that, thinking about things like planting date, maturity group, seeding rate, row spacing, the classical agronomic considerations. Diseases were also listed as one of the primary concerns. So you may notice that we don't have a pathologist here on the call today. Our row crop pathologist has left NC State and taken a new position, but I'll try to cover some of the disease topics, and it's our hope that that position will be refilled to provide that expertise for soybeans in the near future. From an agronomic perspective, what are some questions or experience or concerns that folks have in that space with the early planted soybeans? I see that one of the agronomic topics that came up in the chat was seeding rate. Jay Sullivan asked about seeding rate, and I will say we
failed to detect your speakers connected.
We did do a preparing for Plant 21 post on seeding rate this week, and it's a part of our planting date and maturity group work that we are also investigating the optimal seeding rates within those combinations. But at this point, we're still using the seeding rate recommendations that Dr. Dumpy generated, very robust data set on seeding rate. And so if you look at that data for May planted soybeans, and we're going to assume for earlier planted soybeans as well, that yields are maximized with a final stand of 75,000 plants per acre. Now you need to plant more seeds per acre than that so you can ensure that you reach that final population. You have to look at the germination that's reported on your variety and correct for that. And also, this was another question that came up in the chat about fungicidal seed treatments. We do think in these early planting situations, a use of a fungicidal seed treatment is an important component of protecting stand early in the season and make sure we can reach that final population. I can share some data on that from the past couple of years. Both the soybean extension program and the county agents across the state are doing some work looking at the value of fungicidal seed treatments in early planting situations. Dr. Dunphy did a lot of work looking at non-foliar yield enhancement products and generally found that a fungicidal seed treatment was not necessary to protect yield when beans were being planted after mid-May. But we're talking about planting earlier to try to capitalize on some of these yield benefits. So what have we seen in our small plot research over the past couple of years? We looked at planting from late March to early April, mid to late April, and then mid to late May. And you can see the soil temps across our 2019 and 2020 sites at those planting date and some of the rainfall information. But in 2019, when we planted that early, we saw a large protection of both stand and yield when we were from the use of a fungicidal seed treatment when we were planting that early. In 2020, the impact was much less, which was somewhat surprising because of how wet we were in 2020, but we used different varieties. We had different sites that might have had different levels of disease pressure early in the season. When you looked at mid to late April planting in 2019, we still saw a large yield protection from the use of a fungicidal seed treatment when planting that early. No impact in 2020. And then with mid to late May planting, much less of an impact, which is consistent with that data that Dr. Dunphy had generated previously. But if you combine across the 2 years, we still think, looking at all these sites and knowing some of the conditions when planting early, like cool, wet soils, which can intensify some of these seedling diseases that we encounter, that it'll be important to use a fungicidal seed treatment to try to protect stand in those early planting situations. Now, I'm talking just specifically about a fungicidal seed treatment. I invite Dominic and Adrian to make a couple comments on seed treatments in their respective disciplines.
Sure, I can start with the nematicide seed treatments. In general, we've only seen very modest yield increases with the use of nematicide seed treatment in the range of 1 to 2 bushels. They generally work best under low to moderate nematode pressure. If it's very high nematode pressure, don't really see the return with the use of those seed treatments. So something to consider. The work of looking at different planting times with the use of nematicides really hasn't been well explored.
Yeah, I've already mentioned thrips, which could be a target of insecticide seed treatments. Should also mention bean leaf beetle. Seed treatments do a good job of reducing bean leaf beetle damage. The advantage we have in North Carolina is that bean leaf beetle populations are so low early season that we don't need the insecticidal seed treatment. I would say there is one exception where I would say an insecticidal seed treatment might be something that you want to put out, and that's if you have a cover crop. The reason for that is that it's very difficult to scout the pests in the cover crop that may jump on your beans after you terminate that. So there's some degree of unpredictability there. We have seen issues from a pest called a pea leaf weevil, When you have a legume there, especially one called Austrian winter pea, sometimes that builds up population of this pea leaf weevil, and then they feed on the soybeans, and a seed treatment can reduce that. And the other one is three-cornered alfalfa hopper, especially, I would say, maybe in the north central plain. We've seen some pretty widespread issues from that, where the cover crop wasn't terminated enough prior to planting the soybeans, where three-cornered alfalfa populations have built up. Those can be reduced with a pyrethroid at planting, or you can use an insecticidal seed treatment and have some efficacy. I would encourage growers to either terminate 3 weeks prior to planting, or maybe to try the pyrethroid option. And the reason is because insecticidal seed treatments are not free in terms of cost, and they're not free in terms of knockoffs that you can have later on in the season. So we know that insecticidal seed treatments do their job, and they kill good bugs as well as bad bugs. And so we've seen increased problems with slugs when using insecticidal seed treatments. The seed treatments kill important insect predators of slugs, and that releases those slugs in the environment to feed on seedling soybeans. I don't think it's coincidental that we're seeing increasing problems with slugs, and we're using a lot more insecticidal seed treatments. So those are just some considerations to keep in mind.
Thanks, Dominic. We got a question in here. I think, Luke, you can cover this one. Any thoughts on inoculants because of such a wet winter? And I will say, inoculating soybeans with prices being high is one of the spaces that we're getting more questions in. So any thoughts on that, Luke?
Well, I don't have too much experience in inoculants, but in a broad view, most of our soils will have enough organisms, bacteria, to get a good inoculation. However, when we have these wet soils with lack of oxygen, and also the cold soil, maybe the nodulation will be slower, and maybe will be some advantage to have an inoculation, but I really don't have any data to help on that.
No problem. I know we've got Dr. Dumpy on the line, who's done a lot of work with inoculants over the years. Dr. Dumpy, I'll unmute you if you want to add anything on this topic.
No, I wouldn't add anything.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Dumpy. All right, so another question that we had that came through in the chat is increase in green stem and early planting, early April. And so, green stem is a phenomenon that we don't fully understand yet, all the driving factors behind that. If you attended the early maturing, early planting webinar that we had with our colleagues from the Mid-South who have been working in this system for decades, it's still not a phenomenon that's fully understood in that region of the United States. But what I can say from our research plots over the past few years is green stem has not always been worse in our earliest planted plots. In fact, sometimes it's been worse in the maturity group 4s and 5s that were planted in early to mid-May versus earlier planting date. So I think that when we're going to see green stem has a lot to do with when those plants go under stress, and also the yield potential of the planting date by maturity group combination. So again, it's not a phenomenon that's fully understood. We have some collaborative research projects that we're starting this year where we're trying to get a better pulse on how management and planting date and maturity group all interact to control that phenomenon. But I can say from just what we've seen in our research plots, it's not always the earliest planted, and often it hasn't been the earliest planted beans where we've seen the issues. But we know from going out on grower calls on this topic, it typically is associated with beans, planted from late April to mid-May from what we've seen. But I know we have a lot of growers and agents on this webinar that have experience with green stem if they want to add anything to that question.
I want to add a small point about stink bugs, if I could, real quick, Rachel. Stink bugs can be one of the many things that cause green stem. From what we've seen in our field visits across the state, we don't think they're the driving factor. You tend to see them late season because soybeans are what's left to eat, and stink bug populations are, building up because they're having more generations. There's just more stink bugs around. If you plant your beans earlier, you're less at risk for stink bugs because, again, those things are going to mature later season. They're going to go to those later planted beans. So that's one other thing to consider when you're thinking about the interaction of planting date, green stem, and stink bugs.
Thanks, Dominic. Looks like we've got a question for Wes here. Any test on burn down, lead off, Roundup, and planting 1 week or sooner?
With the lead off, I saw that pop up. I was trying to pull up the label real quick. I'm pretty sure we haven't changed that burn down on that. We still need, let me double check here. I believe we need 30 days pre-plant. Yeah, and it still is. So we haven't really played with that at all in research, I'll be honest. Just because when you're looking at the herbicides in lead off, they're the ones that can end up having some issues, especially with that cool, wet weather, and really don't want to push that. And honestly, I haven't at all in any research. I've only stayed with that 30 days. We do have other options though, if we want to get a little closer to the planting date with that burn down.
Great. So another question that just popped up in the chat is row spacing on early beans, 15 versus 36 inches. So I can only assume, Mike, you're in the coastal plain, even thinking about using 36 inches. And I will talk broadly about what we've seen from a row spacing perspective, and then also talk about some new research that we're going to be doing for the growers in the coastal plain. So when you look at the historical data that Dr. Dunphy generated and some more recent data that we've looked at through working with the county extension agents, typically on average, we see an advantage of narrow versus wider row spacing. And some recent work the county agents did, we saw about a 7 bushel per acre advantage of 15 versus 30s when planting in May. Now, when we also, with that yield contest analysis that I mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, one of the management practices that we looked at for its impact on yield was row spacing. And in that yield contest analysis, row spacing was not a significant predictor of yield, which means that growers entering the yield contest were successfully producing beans on drilled all the way out to 36-inch row spacing. And so that's consistent with some data that our colleagues have generated from the Midwest, is that when other optimal production practices are used, like early planting dates and earlier maturing varieties, growers have more flexibility in what row spacing they use. As you push into a double crop situation, the benefit of a narrow row becomes more important, becomes more pronounced. So based on that yield contest data set, if you can get your 36-inch beans to canopy closure or close in an early planting situation, possibly you're not going to be at a yield disadvantage to using narrower rows. We have heard a lot when we're presenting our row spacing data across the state from growers in the coastal plain who feel like they have often more success on their wide row rip beans than their narrow row beans. And that's something that we have a graduate student, DJ Stokes, who's on the webinar this morning, that's going to be looking at some research stations in the coastal plain in North Carolina over the next couple of years, looking at 15 versus 36-inch rows. We will plant those trials in late April to mid-May and hopefully be able to more robustly answer that in the next couple of years. But if we look at the data from that yield contest data set, where typically growers are planting earlier, there was not an impact of row spacing on soybean yield. To follow up on that, narrow rows on less productive soils versus wider rows. You know, Jay, I think we have to I have to dive more deeply into the data to say that. I will say, you know, on your less productive soils where you might have less vegetative growth, getting to canopy closure to optimize photosynthesis, minimize weed pressure is going to be more important. And so if we're looking at a less productive soil versus these entries coming into that yield contest data set, there could be some differences, and the benefit of a narrow row might be more pronounced in those situations. So we are going to go into the last polling question as we, you know, get towards the end of this webinar. We'd just like to know from the clientele that we have here, what do you think is the most important component of early season soybean management? And I'm sure there's important components that aren't listed here, but variety selection, planting date, pest management, fertility. So to share with the results here, it seems like most of the majority of the attendees identified variety selection as one of the most important components. And there's a lot that goes into that, not just maturity group, but nematode resistance, disease resistance is some of our problematic seedling diseases. Planting date was also identified as important. Interestingly, if you look at our planting date and maturity group research over the past few years, I think that planting date is actually a stronger predictor of high yields, and there might be some more flexibility in maturity group. But if you look at those yield contest data sets, you know, across the state, maturity group was the strongest predictor. So varieties are not something we've specifically touched on in this webinar yet. If anybody has any specifically variety related questions. And one of those that Jenny Carlio popped in the chat is, can indeterminate beans handle cold damage better than determinate beans? So quickly, you know, indeterminate varieties are typically early maturity group 5 or less. Most of those beans have been bred for production in the Midwest, but growers can successfully produce those in our environment. From what we've seen in our research over the past couple of years, where we've been planting in mid to late March, you know, in some situations, all the maturity groups and so different growth habits have handled those cold conditions similarly. But I do think, you know, with this cold snap that we have coming over the next couple of days, that's something that we can take a look at in our research plots, where we have already maturity groups 2 through 7 planted. And that's a good point, Jenny. I guess I should say I don't know for sure, but we haven't seen anything so far that would indicate there's large differences. One of the questions that came through the chat, best growth stage for fungicide applications on early beans. And I think that that is an area where we need to generate some more information. There's the consideration about yield protection, but also the need to protect quality, which interplays with these fungicide applications in early beans. And I don't think we can robustly answer that question yet, Bryson. Yes, in our yield contest data set, foliar fungicides were identified as a strong predictor of yield. regardless of maturity group you were using. But in that yield contest data set, that data is representing a lot of different fungicide products used, a lot of different timings used, sometimes multiple timings. So one of the projects that we are starting this year that we're going to do collaboratively with our pathologist is to look at timing of a fungicide in maturity groups 3, 4, and 5, and not look at different timings, look at multiple timings, and look at the impact not only on yield or quality. So hopefully we'll be able to answer that with data over the next couple of years. I don't think we have that data. A lot of the fungicide work Dr. Dunphy did was looking at fungicides applied at R2, R3, but the timing question is something we need to get more information on. Another question in the chat is about harvest timing and possible desiccation. So no doubt, timely harvest is critical to protect seed quality in these early maturing, early planted beans. And sometimes even when our growers are committed to timely harvest, the weather is driving seed quality issues that aren't allowing for timely harvest, like we saw in the coastal plain last year, where growers caught 4 to 8 inches of rain at the beginning of September. But the desiccant question is a good one. Wes, I know you've done some desiccant work in the past with Dr. Dunphy. Do you want to add any comments there?
I'd say the biggest thing we've seen, sorry, I had to clear my throat there. The biggest thing we saw, with the research and have seen in a number of trials is, the earlier you desiccate, the more potential you have for losing yield. So you want to make sure you have as much yield as you want before you go ahead and spray. But that's one of the biggest things, and then timing and products, vary basically on situation. So we can throw some blanket stuff out, but it's just best to kind of pick and choose based on what you have going on in the field.
And that is an area that we know that there's a lot of grower interest in. The soybean producers, I know I've been working with some of the consultants in North Carolina to generate some information in that space, and hopefully as more of our growers plant earlier maturing varieties, we can provide more information on that topic. One of the questions that came up earlier, which I didn't know we'd have time for, we're running up on the end, but Dominic, I think it would be good for you to address this. You've already mentioned stink bugs, but can you talk more broadly about some of the issues we encountered last year and how we need to be committed to season-long scouting for stink bugs?
Yeah, I don't know if they'll answer specifically what you're getting at, but soybeans are susceptible to stink bug damage through R7. Now, it takes a lot more at R7 to cause an issue, and generally you're just looking at a quality issue on the seed and not as much yield. But they can do it when numbers are high. Really, we need to be scouting our soybeans for insect pests from, I would say, R2 to R7, and ideally on a field-to-field basis, which is unrealistic unless you probably have a good consultant. So I would encourage growers that are serious about growing soybeans to hire a consultant, because it's a commitment that needs to be done. For stink bugs, the most critical management period is the R3 to R5 stages. That's where they can cause pretty severe yield damage. As you get into R5, you can start seeing issues with seed quality. And then the other thing I'd say is where I expect to see more stink bugs in the system this year. And the reason for that is we have 3 species that are problematic in general in soybeans. We have brown stink bug and green stink bug, which are native. We have another stink bug that's not native, but it might as well be because it's been here since the 1950s. And it's called the southern green stink bug. It is like from somewhere in Africa. It doesn't like really cold winters, but we haven't had enough cold winters to knock it back. So I've already noticed that these things have emerged. They're out there in the system, and we're going to see them later on in the year. They're going to visit us again in soybeans. So just be committed to scouting and treating based on our thresholds if needed.
Thanks for touching on that, Dominic. We know that was one of our larger production challenges in 2020. So we're running up on 9 o'clock here, but we are happy to stay on. If folks have any additional questions they want to drop in the chat or just unmute and ask.
Dr. Van.
Hey, Al.
Hi there. I wanted to ask, I don't know if this has been addressed. I got in late but on it, but one of the things I wondered about with going back to this green stem, has anybody looked at the interaction of nematodes and soybean diseases? One thing I thought was very interesting, where we did that nematode survey up here in the Northeast, was the high frequency of I think it was lesion, wasn't it, Dr. Gorney, in a lot of our fields. But I'm just wondering, I know that there's in other crops like peaches or irish potatoes, there are interactions where you see between nematodes attacking the roots of a crop and then some other organism, as a secondary. Has anybody looked there, or is that a possibility with what we've seen so far with this green stem?
So I'll jump in and say I'm not aware of any research showing interaction between nematode damage and green stem specifically. I guess it's always a possibility, but not that I'm aware of. And lesion nematode can be very damaging. We found it way more than I thought. I was also surprised by those results. So I think that lesion nematode is one we're going to really have to keep an eye on moving forward. And there's about 5 or 6 different species of lesion nematode across the state.
But, I know that some of the high yielding people are getting high yield soybeans are using various seed treatments, and they may be using the nematicide, but I just keep wondering if one of the things that could be causing us to not be improving in soybean yields might be nematodes or some kind of interaction with disease or whatever.
Yeah, that's a great question. I wish I had more information on that at this time. And again, the seed treatment nematicides, they seem to do best under those lower pressures. If it's a very high level of nematodes, high counts of nematodes, we don't really see them being knocked back as well with those seed treatments.
Thank you, Dr. Gorney.
Any other questions from folks? If not, just a few reminders. We plan to continue to post in that Preparing to Plant 21 series on the Soybean Extension Portal. We're posting a topic each week. So our next topic is going to be related fertility. Then we're going to have some nematode related topics, maybe some herbicide related topics. So please make sure you're looking on the Soybean Extension Portal for those upcoming posts. We also plan to have a mid-season and late season soybean management webinar, so we can take questions on some of the pertinent production topics during that time of the season. So if you have any suggestions on, how things flow today or how we could improve the webinar to be more impactful for our clientele in the future, please let us know. I will tell folks this session was recorded and we will post it on the Soybean Extension Portal for anybody that was not able to attend today. So if we don't see any more questions, we thank y'all for being here. Wish you the best as you get going here in the 21 season with your soybean crop and your whole operation.